When Mom first talked about Tom, I felt a strange unease, even though I couldn't explain why. He was a kind person. There was nothing bad to say about him. He didn't try to present himself as something extraordinary. He just came over, like any other person. But I noticed how he looked at her, with an attention I hadn't seen before. And that unsettled me. I didn't want anything to change. I loved our little house, that old kitchen where my brother and I often sat doing homework while Mom cooked dinner. I loved the smell of fresh bread and the old photos on the walls, reminding us that we had been together, as a family, until now, despite everything. At first, when Mom and Tom started seeing each other, I thought it would pass, like many of her relationships had before. But that didn't happen. I realized she really wanted him to be part of our lives. And so it happened. A few months later, he became our husband, and she became his wife. Everything happened so quickly. Tom insisted that we move into his house, a larger, brighter place, but with an atmosphere that felt foreign to me. The new house became something distant and unfamiliar. I couldn't get used to it. Every morning, I wanted to go back to that cozy house where everything felt right, where it was easier to breathe. And then Kate appeared, his daughter who moved in with us right after the wedding. She was older than me, and I felt like she was hiding something. There was a hidden story in her eyes that I couldn't understand. Kate was unpredictable. At first glance, very friendly and attentive, but her habit of constantly studying something, never allowing herself to relax, was strange. I found it hard to accept her as part of our family. We barely talked, and I always felt there was something invisible hanging between us. At first, I tried to be kind, not showing my unease, but the more I saw her, the more that feeling grew. Something was wrong. Everything was not as it should be. Kate acted as if it was perfectly normal to live in someone else's house, as if she was its true mistress. She adapted easily to the new rules, but I kept missing that old sense of safety that I once had. Even in moments when I sat in silence, hearing her footsteps in the hallway or her quiet laughter in the kitchen, it all seemed out of place. I didn't know what would happen next. And maybe that was the scariest feeling. When everything feels new, incomprehensible, alien, and you feel like you can't change anything. One night, when it seemed like everything in the house had quieted down, I woke up to a strange sound. It was late, and outside there was an eerie silence with only the light of the street lamp casting shadows on the floor, creating a peculiar atmosphere in the room. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. Maybe I hadn't fully drifted off to sleep yet. But after a few seconds, the sound repeated. It was soft, almost indistinct, but I could clearly hear it. It was something like a creak, but not quite. As if someone was carefully moving at the other end of the house, sliding across the floor. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a nightmarish vision. But the sound came again. I got out of bed, stepping cautiously onto the cold floor. Fear gripped me, and I didn't know exactly what scared me. What was it? Why couldn't I calm down? My heart was pounding, and my thoughts raced to find an explanation. Could it have been the wind playing with the windows or the creak of the old house coming to life on its own? I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but it wasn't. There was something unclear, elusive about it, like a shadow that beckons but doesn't let you understand what it really is. I stood up and headed toward the door. Through the hallway, I could hear the same sound. It was coming from Kate's room. I froze, listening. There was something strange about it. She had never gotten up so late, and it was unlikely that it was something trivial, especially if it made me feel so uneasy. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to gather my thoughts. Could it have been Kate? Why wasn't she sleeping at that time? I didn't know what to do. All I could do was cautiously walk to her door. I could hear her moving inside, but nothing more. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was something more. I could feel the restless sound growing clearer, as though someone was waiting for me. But when I reached the door, everything went silent. Suddenly, the silence in the house became even thicker. I stood there, not knowing what to do next. Why was I so scared? What was I supposed to make of this? The next morning, Kate acted as if nothing had happened. I couldn't understand how this was possible. Last night I had been on the brink of hysteria, but in the morning she was the same as always. Calm, friendly, and carefree. She made breakfast as if nothing had occurred, and her face only expressed kindness and the mundane. We sat at the table and her smile seemed genuine. But there was something about her calmness that made me uneasy. Everything was just too perfect. I felt like an outsider, someone observing the lives of others but unable to find my place in this world. I tried to believe that the phone call from last night had been just a coincidence, but the inner unease didn't leave me. "How did you sleep?" she asked, skillfully pouring coffee into the cups. The answer was simple. "Fine." But there was something in her eyes that made me doubt. I couldn't even understand why. Maybe it was the look I caught when she raised her head. It was too calm, too indifferent, as if she hadn't noticed what had been happening with me. I decided that maybe it was just my thoughts. My anxiety could have been the result of that night's strange event, which I still couldn't explain. I started to focus on ordinary things: the cup of coffee, a conversation with my brother, the morning silence. But deep down, I felt that something was wrong. I could feel that something had irrevocably changed. Mom came home from work earlier than usual, and the house filled with her laughter, her usual worries. But even with her presence, there was something elusive. Kate continued to act as if everything was fine, but I noticed the small things. Her hands, which lingered too long on the table, her gaze that sometimes rested on me when I wasn't paying attention. These little moments, insignificant to most, sparked anxiety in me. I couldn't understand why this feeling tormented me so much. I couldn't find an explanation. Everything seemed so clear, so normal, but within this normality there was something empty, something unfinished, that kept me restless. Why couldn't I believe in her calmness? Why had her looks, her words suddenly become so important? I knew I needed to talk to Mom, but I couldn't find the words to explain what was happening. The atmosphere in the house felt alien, like I had entered someone else's life, one that didn't belong to me. And each day spent here convinced me more and more that I couldn't be a part of this new reality. With each passing day, Kate became more persistent. At first, it was small moments that I could easily ignore. She would come into my room to ask if I needed anything or offer help when I could handle it myself. Seemingly nothing unusual, but there was something in her behavior that made me uneasy. It was as if she was too attentive, too interested in what I was doing, and that was something I didn't want. I remember one day when I was doing homework, Kate came into my room holding a cup of tea. "Maybe you need a break?" I was a bit surprised because she had never shown that much attention before. I was simply focused on my tasks, and I didn't want anyone interrupting. But Kate kept standing there, watching me as though she was waiting for me to say or do something. "No, it's fine. Thank you." I tried to be polite, but inside something was protesting. Why couldn't she just leave me alone? Why did her presence feel so insistent, as if she was expecting something more from me? As each day passed, such encounters increased. She wasn't just coming into my room to offer help. It was as if she was looking for moments to be near me. She would offer help when I didn't need it, ask questions that didn't require answers, and her voice sounded as if she was trying to hide something important that wasn't being said. I tried to avoid her, retreating to my room and closing the door, but she always found a way to be nearby. And what bothered me even more was that I began to notice her gazes. When she thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch her stare, which was too attentive, too analytical. It was almost as if she was trying to read me, trying to extract something from me that I didn't want to share. At some point, I realized I was no longer at peace. When I was alone, the house felt much lighter, but the moment Kate appeared nearby, something in the atmosphere would shift. I no longer felt safe like I used to, back in the old house. Now, every time she was around, I felt a sense of unease, but I couldn't understand where it was coming from. I tried to ignore these feelings, but the more she was around, the clearer it became that I wouldn't be able to avoid this sensation. All I could do was hide in my room, hoping she would leave. But I knew it was only a temporary solution. Mom and my brother went to visit Grandma for a couple of days, leaving me home alone with Kate. In a normal situation, this wouldn't have raised any doubts. I would have just gone on with my usual routine, but now everything felt different. It seemed like the house had grown even quieter, as if its emptiness was filled with something inexpressible. The feeling was so intense that I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me, even when I sat alone. Every step, every sound seemed louder than usual. The house was too silent, and I could feel time stretching slowly, as if it were filled with some kind of misunderstanding. Kate was nearby. It was as if she knew I wasn't comfortable and didn't stay far. I tried to avoid her presence, but she was always there, a little closer than I wanted. Sometimes I'd hear her move behind the wall, and it would make me tense again. "What are you going to do today?" she asked when I sat in my room, absorbed in reading. I looked up and saw her standing in the doorframe, tilting her head slightly as if waiting for my response. I felt something tighten inside me. I didn't want to answer, didn't want her to be there. I couldn't explain why, but her presence brought a strange unease. It was like a sense of alienness, even though she was part of our family. All this time, I had tried to keep my distance, but the more I did that, the closer she seemed to get. "I'll just read a little," I replied, hoping she would catch the hint. But instead of leaving, Kate took a step forward and sat on the chair beside me. Her presence was too overwhelming, and I couldn't help but notice how her gaze slid over me. She didn't say anything, just sat there quietly, but somehow it was still too noticeable for me. I found it hard to concentrate. Every movement, every glance from her became too significant. When she stood up to leave, I heard her footsteps slow down, as if she didn't want to leave the room. I tried to ignore it, but for a moment, I felt as though I was starting to feel her pressure. She wasn't just occupying the space, it was as if she was claiming it. When Kate left, I was left in silence, but the anxiety didn't leave me. It was a strange feeling of loneliness. Not that I was completely alone, but more like I was surrounded by something invisible that wouldn't let me relax. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt like something in the house was going on that I couldn't fully comprehend. And the worst part? I didn't know what to do about it. One day, after I returned from school, I decided to spend the evening in my room trying to relax a bit. The house was quiet, and the only sound breaking the silence was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat on the bed, opened a book, but my thoughts wouldn't let me focus. All day, I had felt that something was wrong, and with every moment spent with Kate, that anxiety grew stronger. I turned the page, but a soft click of a door caught my attention. Kate stood in the doorway, her face slightly tense, yet she still smiled, as always. "Hi," she said, slowly entering the room and walking toward my desk. "Is it okay if I hang out here for a bit?" I froze for a second. This wasn't something unusual. She had come into my room several times before, but this time something about her manner was different. She wasn't just standing there. It was as if she was looking for something, some moment to make contact. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for me to invite her to stay, even though I didn't want her presence at all. "Well, if you want, you can sit," I replied, hoping she wouldn't stay too long. She sat in the chair by the window, not taking her eyes off me. I tried to return to my book, but I couldn't focus because of her gaze. It was too intense, as if she was searching for something in my face, some reaction. I tried to concentrate, but her presence in the room became more and more palpable. After a few minutes, she suddenly spoke, her voice soft, almost gentle. "You're always so closed off," she said, almost casually. "You know, you could be more open. It's not that scary." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't expected those words. It was sudden, too personal. I looked up and met her gaze. She was still sitting calmly, as if it was completely natural. "I just don't like it when people invade my space," I said, trying to smooth over my awkwardness. It wasn't entirely true, but I couldn't find the right words. Kate fell silent, but a genuine curiosity flickered in her eyes, making me feel uneasy. It was hard for me to understand her intentions. Why did she come to me so often? Why did it seem like she was always looking for moments to intrude on my life? "You don't mind if I just stay here, do you?" she asked again, her voice now a soft reminder that she wasn't planning to leave. I sighed, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to continue this conversation, but I couldn't find the strength to ask her to leave. It was as if there wasn't enough strength in me to tell her that her presence made me uncomfortable. It was like there was an invisible barrier between us that I couldn't overcome. She smiled again, and I once again felt my space shrink. I tried not to think about what was happening, but every moment with her, every glance, every gesture created a strange feeling that I was caught in a game where I didn't know the rules. The days grew longer, and with each new morning, it became harder to find even a trace of the calm I once knew. I noticed more and more how Kate was becoming part of my space, and despite all my attempts to maintain distance, her presence became unbearably palpable. But one evening, when I was coming home from a walk, I noticed that Kate was sitting in the kitchen, her head lowered, staring into the emptiness. She looked strange, not the usual Kate with her light and confident smile. Her face was serious, her eyes dull, as if something heavy was weighing on her. I decided not to interfere, but something in her behavior made me slow my steps. She lifted her eyes and saw me, and instead of offering the usual greeting, her face softened and she spoke quietly. "You know, sometimes I feel like I can't live without controlling everything around me, and that scares me." I froze in place, not expecting such words. This wasn't the Kate I knew. She had always seemed confident, not overly open, but never the type to share such deep feelings. And her confession, though it sounded sincere, made me feel that something wasn't right. But I couldn't stop myself. "What do you mean?" I asked, not knowing how to react to her honesty. Kate tilted her head slightly, her gaze a bit embarrassed, but she continued. "I always thought I could control my life, that I could control everything, but sometimes it feels like it's all slipping away from me, like sand through my fingers. And I'm afraid that one day it will break me. I try to be perfect, but I still can't figure out what I need. I want people to believe in me, but I don't believe in myself." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but I felt how these words pierced me. She had never spoken so openly. I didn't know how to respond. Maybe I was just shocked by how vulnerable she suddenly became. It was so unlike her. The one always ready with a smile, pretending everything was under control. I remained silent, and Kate seemed not to expect a response. She just sat there, and I didn't know how to behave in this new context, now that she was so open with me. "I'm just struggling, you know?" she added, standing up and heading for the door, as though not wanting to continue the conversation, but leaving me in complete confusion. Her words stayed with me, and I couldn't forget them. It was as though someone had opened a door to her soul, and I felt that she might not be the mysterious figure I once thought she was. But this sincerity left me bewildered. She had spent so long building a barrier between us, and suddenly she tore it down. I didn't know how to respond to all of this. Now everything seemed more complicated, and I felt that I was in a situation where I couldn't find the right answer. With each passing day, I felt more and more as if Kate had become an undeniable part of my life, like her presence had woven itself into the fabric of my world. The more I tried to distance myself, the stronger her gaze seemed to follow me, as if I were a part of some game with rules I didn't understand. I began noticing strange reactions within myself. Sometimes it felt as though she was sitting on the other side of the house, and yet her gaze still reached me, like an invisible thread extending from her eyes to mine. Those moments of unease, when I could feel her presence even when she was far away, became too real for me. I would freeze in those moments, as though an invisible force was preventing me from breathing. Sometimes her words played in my mind like a broken record. What did she mean when she told me I had to be there? Why did her phrases about control and perfection keep me on edge? I tried to find some logical explanation for it, but every attempt to justify her behavior was in vain. There were moments when I managed to distract myself from this feeling. For example, when I sat in my room and listened to music, trying to forget everything. But the instant I turned off the player, silence would fall, and I'd feel her gaze again. At any moment, I could feel her watching me, as if her eyes could be anywhere, even deep within my consciousness. I started to notice that my own movements had become less certain. When I walked down the hall, I felt as though she was somewhere nearby, and I wanted to hide, to disappear. Every time she drew near, even if it was invisible to others, it left a trace in me that I couldn't erase. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching every step I took, every word I spoke, every glance I gave. It became part of my daily existence, this constant feeling of being watched. And what troubled me the most was that I couldn't find any reason for it. Kate wasn't doing anything that overtly crossed my boundaries, but her presence had become so heavy that I could no longer ignore it. I couldn't cope with this anymore. I understood that perhaps it was time to do something. But what exactly? I didn't know. One evening, when I returned home from a walk, everything in the house felt unusual. Silence hung in the air, and I suddenly felt uneasy. I entered my room, tossed my bag onto the desk, and noticed something on my work surface. It was a small note with the words, "You should have been there." My hands trembled as I picked it up, and my eyes involuntarily scanned the paper, trying to make sense of these words. I couldn't understand what it meant. Who had left the note? Why was it there? And why did these words sound so familiar? They were almost identical to what Kate had said during the phone call a few nights ago. My heart tightened with fear. I looked around my room, searching for something that could explain the note, but everything looked as usual. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. I walked over to my nightstand and noticed something in the corner of the table right under a book. It was a small electronic device, a phone. It wasn't mine, and I immediately knew whose it was. It was Kate's phone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Why was her phone here? Why hadn't I noticed it before? I picked up the phone, and before I knew what to do, I saw something on the screen that shook me to the core. It was a video. In the video were Kate and me. We were standing in the hallway of the house. I couldn't understand why we were filmed, but every frame felt like a weight pressing down on me. We were captured in a moment when I was likely unaware of the camera, not realizing we were being recorded. My legs buckled, and in horror, I dropped the phone. How was this possible? Why had she filmed us? Why had she left this video with me? I couldn't believe what I had seen. My head spun, and an overwhelming anxiety gripped me, one I couldn't shake. It felt as if the world had turned upside down, and I was at the center of this nightmare. I tried to breathe and calm down, but deep inside, I felt that this was a violation of some boundary. How could I trust someone who had so blatantly invaded my personal space? Someone who left this awful sign with me. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal. Suddenly, the door opened, and Kate appeared in the room. Her gaze immediately fell on the phone lying on the floor. I couldn't hide my reaction, and seeing her, I felt a surge of rage inside me. But instead of speaking, I froze. "You found it," she said, her voice so calm that it made everything even more terrifying. "You were supposed to see it. We both needed to see it. You don't understand why it's important, but you will when the time comes." Her words felt like a knife piercing me. I tried to gather my thoughts, but it was futile. I felt emptiness take over. And in that moment, one thing became clear to me. Nothing would ever be the same as it was before. And I didn't know how to live with that knowledge. The next morning felt like a cold wind had penetrated my soul. I woke up with heavy thoughts, unable to shake the moment when I discovered the video. Everything that had happened now seemed unbearably alien. I couldn't believe what Kate had done. How could I have not noticed it for so long? How could I have not seen that behind her quiet glances and kind offers, there was something much deeper and stranger? Mom returned home, and the atmosphere in the house immediately changed. She was in her usual mood, with traces of fatigue still on her face from the trip. But to me, she seemed so distant, as if there were an invisible barrier between us. I tried to find the strength to talk, to tell her what had happened, but I could barely get a word out. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of cold tea, not knowing how to begin. All I wanted was to go back to the past, to the days when we were just a family, when everything was fine. But that had become impossible. And the more I tried to find an explanation, the more it became clear to me that nothing would ever be the same. Kate acted as though nothing had happened. She moved around the house with the same calmness she always had. There wasn't a hint of guilt in her eyes. It was as if she were completely detached from what had occurred. And that terrified me. She knew I had uncovered her secret, but she continued this masquerade as if everything were fine. I tried to talk to her, but every time I approached, she would immediately disappear, hiding in her room or down the hallway. It was like she was avoiding me, but it wasn't the kind of avoidance I was used to. It was a cold silence, as if she was waiting for me to give up first. That night, I once again felt that emptiness. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, but thoughts of what I had gone through wouldn't leave me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a feeling of loss. Everything I had once known now seemed questionable. I felt like something important was crumbling, something I could never replace. I couldn't understand how to live with this, how to return to a normal life. I thought about what Kate had done, and every time her face came to mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer the person I had once considered part of my family. Now, everything was different, and I knew it was impossible to bring things back. I felt that the time that had passed was gone, and I had to learn to live with that. But how could I do that? When I knew that everything I had loved was destroyed? Quietly, but resolutely, I accepted that I could not change the past. Now, all that was left was to come to terms with the fact that I could no longer reclaim the peace and certainty I once felt. Several days passed, but the feeling of unease still lingered. Everything that had happened now seemed unreal, as though I had found myself in someone else's strange script, where I didn't know my role. The house was filled with silence, but it was different now. Not the calm silence I had been used to, but one heavy with something invisible, something oppressive. Kate hardly appeared. She disappeared into her room, and when she did come out, her face remained as unreadable as before. I tried to understand what she was thinking, but it was impossible. One day, I gathered my courage. I couldn't live in this state of suspension anymore. I needed to do something. I needed to figure things out. To close the door that hid so many unanswered questions, I walked up to Kate's room and knocked. "Can I come in?" For a moment, there was silence on the other side, then her voice, calm but with a hint of surprise. "Of course." I entered and saw her sitting on the bed. Her eyes met mine immediately, and there was no fear or regret in them, just calm. "You knew I'd find the video," I said, looking directly at her. She nodded slowly. "Yes." "Why?" Kate sighed, placed her hands on her knees and looked away, as though considering what to say. "I wanted you to see that there is more between us than just what you think," she finally said. "You've been trying to ignore me, acting like I'm not here. But I am. I'm here." Her words stirred something strange in me. It felt like I was misunderstanding them, that there was something hidden beneath them I couldn't grasp. "You left that video on purpose? To what? Confuse me?" There was more emotion in my voice than I intended to show. Kate smiled, but not in a cruel way, more with a sense of tiredness. "Number, I wanted you to look at yourself from the outside, to see how you're running away." I froze. "I'm not running away." "You are," she said quietly. "From the very beginning. From me, from this house, from everything that doesn't fit into your picture of the world." I didn't know what to say. Her words, despite their strangeness, had hit the mark. We sat in silence. It wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was full of meaning. "What now?" I finally asked. Kate shrugged. "It all depends on you." I stared at her, trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. I couldn't just forget everything that had happened, but I also knew that I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel anything. I took a step back. I need time. Kate nodded as if she knew I would say that. Okay. I turned around and left. For the first time in a long while, I felt a little lighter. I didn't know where this conversation would lead, but I had taken the first step. And that was enough.